So, hi, Lewis. Thanks for joining us. It's great to have you here and to see your incredible new work, Circumstantial Pleasures, which you've been making. You were making between 2012 and 2019. So, I wonder if we could just start maybe by talking a bit about the project's beginnings, and I just wondered if you can recall how it began and maybe which elements were most important or clear to you at that point when you started.
Well, actually, it starts even way sooner than that, and about really it starts when I was a young filmmaker, and I got very attracted to historical sources for my collage material, and things that were either from my life or before I was born. And I thought I would work on those things for a little while and then, sort of satisfy that, kind of like, the way novelists, they write autobiographical first novels and then they move on, right? And that I would move into contemporary material. Not that I was collecting contemporary material, but that I thought that that's what I would do. And then I sort of I just never really left that,
Right.
necessarily that I was making autobiographies in any normal sense of the word, but I just wasn't. I was just happy hanging out with these older materials, these outmoded materials, and what I could do with those, the freedom they gave me. And I didn't like the way the world looked as much as it looked, so that was another reason as it looked in a contemporary setting. But ultimately I did start to collect. And in the 2000s, after I'd moved to Los Angeles at the end of end of 1998, it started, I started to really seriously collect, and I kind of knew that I was going to do something, I'd made certain films occasionally that did deal with contemporary materials, and they sort of played more like almost like sci-fi in some kind of way, the way I was using them. And I knew I had some kind of film in there. And then about 2006 or 7, I read a very long article in the New Yorker about pandemics, and immediately felt, it tapped into the kind of, I'm a rather anxious person anyway, but it tapped into like my doom and gloom sense of the universe, of like when a pandemic was going to hit and what it would do. And I don't remember it, at this point, I don't remember how accurate it is in terms of what we're actually living in now. But it had a lot of information about it, I think. And I was fascinated by that as a theme, and started to think about, I realized at that point, like I didn't really know enough about the contemporary world, because my head had been so stuck in the past. Like I thought, I know the narratives of the mid 20th century, of my childhood, of like my adolescence, but I knew less like what I thought the major narratives were of, or I knew them, but I couldn't describe them to myself even. And so I thought, it's time to start to do that. And this article sort of jumped me in that direction. And about that time, I'd been working in 16, and I hit a place where it just was becoming too expensive for me to keep doing it. It was costing me, like, to make like a 10-minute film would cost me like $2,000 US just by the time I was finished. And like I had a mortgage, I was underemployed. As a teacher, I was only employed part-time, and it just seemed like I've got to and then I was employed full-time, but I was at a very low salary. And it was like, I got a mortgage, I got a kid, I got, this is just not working, like I don't know that I can keep doing this as much as I like it, So I started to toe the water of digital and waited till it got to a certain place where I was seeing in other colleagues' work in experimental film, two filmmakers, Gretchen Skogerson and Vincent Grenier, the way they were using it convinced me that it was as good as 16 at that point. And then there were people at Cal Arts where I teach. I actually don't teach in the animation school or the film program. I teach in the theater school, strangely enough, but that's me. I'm always a fish out of water. So I was speaking to people though in the animation program, and they were telling me, and some of them helped me set up, my students and different faculty helped me set up my first digital setup. And this is before like Dragon Frame exists and stuff like that. You had to do all these elaborate ways to fix, to kind of make quick times, which would fail. And then the mistakes, it would kind of randomize the files and kind of mix and match the sequence of your shot. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting mistake, and I'd use some of that, and so the first digital film I made was called Antigenic Drift. And it was inspired by this article about pandemics, because antigenic drift is a scientific term that means how viruses replicate themselves to keep themselves viable in a population that has some immunity or increasing immunity to them. So they're trying to stay active too that way. And it struck me as sort of like being like collage, like where you're reusing the same materials. And so I loved it as a metaphor that way. You're reusing the same materials, but it keeps changing. And so you keep moving forward in some kind of way. And so that was the first time I really went after it. So that was 2008. So 2012, I started to make things that ultimately became Capitalist Rotors, the first film of this series, but I was calling it Circumstantial Pleasures. And I went through a lot of iterations of it, 2 different soundtracks of pop songs for, and 1 jazz tune, 2 different iterations of it through 2016. That was more like a 15-minute film, and it was called Circumstantial Pleasures. Even showed in a gallery in Zurich, the Greeter Gallery, and it just never felt completely right. Like, and people would sort of look at it and they'd go, kind of like, well, like especially in the gallery installation, I've watched this now 3 times. I remember somebody telling me. But what is it? What are you trying to describe? And they got a review like that too, kind of like, what was I trying? And it was kind of like, well, all right, I need to focus this more. And then it suddenly, after that moment, I decided that didn't hold. That became Capitalist Rotors instead of Circumstantial Pleasures, different soundtrack. And then it became a series. And then with Trump's reelection, the whole thing really exploded into, okay, I really need to just deal with the contemporary. And I was, it was coming out of my deep concern about the growing environmental crisis through the 2000s as a front brain, foregrounded priority that the world needed to address. And capitalism, which is always in my work in different ways. And so it, at that point, it really took off. But this is like the hardest set of films I've ever made. Films would fall apart on me. I would think they were done. I would show them in some kind of public setting that was like a one-off. And then I'd find out they weren't done. They'd need to be retitled. They'd need to, they'd need reshaping. even up to the moment that this series premiered, I had to cut down. The second film had been 10 minutes, ramification lesions, microbial stress. It was like 10 minutes. I had to cut it down to like about 6.5 to make it work. So even there, this was like at the 11th hour before it was going to premiere in New York last February, at the end of February. And I sent it out to film festivals and nobody would show it. Everything I'd hear back from juries is they'd be very split on it. But very few people seemed to be picking up on what it was actually addressing. And then when I showed it in New York, the pandemic, it was the eve of the pandemic. Everybody knew it was coming to New York at this point. It was late February and people were preparing. Some people didn't come to the show because they were afraid of being in a crowd at that point, which made sense. That was it.
Yeah.
Suddenly it was like the light in the room turned on and people could understand what it was that it was addressing, both about capitalism and about, the virus, which, didn't exist when I was making this, but I was aware of the idea of pandemics and of the way that urban society had drifted away from, from a balance with nature,
Just getting back to when you were talking about the kind of the difficulty you had in making it and getting it to exist in the form that it seemed like it wasn't just about it communicating to other people, but also maybe for yourself as well. Do you think that that's because it was so kind of addressing contemporary issues that when you were working before with things that were maybe using imagery from the past, or it was more sort of separate ideas that you could kind of look at from outside of, maybe it was harder to kind of to fully know what the ideas and the themes of your work, how they should be made? And I guess that connects to my other question, which is,
that's a big question. So hold the second question. Okay. So what you're asking, Edwin, is quite interesting to me about process. And it's not that I didn't have trouble at other times, but there was sort of a different kind of leniency with describing the past. There was more flexibility there and a kind of forgiveness. So, for instance, I work with like elliptical narrative in my films, usually, although this set of films, Circumstantial Pleasures, is not at all narrative. And anytime I tried to make it narrative, it wouldn't accept that, actually. So I kept looking for opportunities even for that to be there, especially with the Scott Walker. And I realized, no, you can't have I can't have characters in the normal way that I normally work with characters. So part of it is that I was on new terrain for myself and I was pushing myself, but part of it is just the nature of describing this particular moment of the contemporary world. And I was, as I got to the end, more towards the end of the process, I started to understand how volatile everything was. The last film that I completed was Ramification Lesions, and that uses newspapers, imagery that I collected over the last, 5-6 years. And I realized what a kind of diary that was and how quickly all that was out of date. And that film just kept, changing itself because of what it wasn't including, that it needed to include, what it just was out of date really quick. And I wasn't even sure I should include it in the series at different times. So, and that was true of a lot of these things. I wasn't sure, partly because world events were so rapid that things felt like they weren't. And then I eventually just had to kind of accept the fact that something even like ramification lesions dealing with rather recent newspaper imagery felt out of date. I read an interview with, or maybe it was a portrait of William Gibson, the novelist, right when I was finishing the film. And he described having the same problem. He was writing about the present, and that he had to delay the publication of his novel because everything had changed, and he had to rewrite it. So you know, it's just like. And then I have a friend, wonderful filmmaker in Hong Kong, Ip Yuk Yu, who was making a street film about like shooting silent images in the street of especially of the protests over the last number of years. And then it reached this kind of point where things were exploding and there was violence and this, and he felt like his film had gone off the rails. Like it didn't matter anymore what he had described. And I tried to talk opposite to him about this. I said, no, this is quite amazing what you've recorded, even if you don't feel like you can go out and film the explosion into the street riots, you know, and but he was experiencing the same thing too. So I think that there's something to this about when you're on things that are breaking, of how hard it is to kind of set them in place. But since I work improvisationally anyway, I kind of don't really know what I'm doing most of the time anyway. I'm kind of feeling it out. I make films partly to express things that I'm thinking about or feeling, or I know what I want to say, but mostly to discover really what I think about something, or
Sure.
And understand, you know.
Yeah.
You can answer part of your question.
I think you kind of answered it really, but I guess just we've just got a couple of minutes left in our allocated time, but I just wondered if your feelings and understanding of the kind of not necessarily the events, but the ideas and concepts that you were dealing with, if that changed through making the film, do you think, either through your research or through actually dealing with it in process?
Yeah, they did in process. And this film is very different for me in terms of the way I'm using digital, for one thing. So there's this section in Virulent Capital, which is, I think it's like the fourth film in, and there's this section where there's this man who's either this comic book image that I took of an older man, and he's got his hands on his like the upper part of his pants, and his zipper is undone. And it's either that he's buttoning his pants and closing them up, or he's taking them off. And it's kind of this in-between moment. And that's why I was interested in using it, was that it's not one or the other. You could read it either way. And I put him through, it's just one image. He doesn't change in that way, but I built around him all these color changes, through gelled transparent plastics, but also, and then other images that are popping in and out, and kind of anatomy drawings and all kinds of things that are about this profile that are of this man undoing his pants, or buttoning them up. And it goes on for quite a while. And one of the things I started to do was play with the digital settings of the color temperature of the light, picking, like shooting under tungsten light, but picking fluorescent light, and what kinds of changes these occur. So the color is changing radically all through the section. And I look at that now and I think, wow, like I have no idea what I even did at this point. Like I couldn't reconstruct it for you because I was, was working in a very intuitively and very quickly as I shot this thing. It just like opened up for me.
Yeah.
That it didn't need to be edited. It did, but I always, whatever I do, it has to be edited. But it's like that kind of gets to the essence of how the kind of artifice that runs through the whole film, which relates to, my themes about the man-made and, how scientists now call this period the Anthropocene, and as that man is changing the world through our actions, right? That humans are changing the world. And it's like, there's something about digital that really goes along with that too, of like how far away that is. It's got a different aura to it, which I've gotten used to and I love, but it's not that analog kind of aura.
Yeah.
And it there's a toxicity to it. There's beauty in it, but it's a hard, austere kind of beauty, also. And it's very sanitized.
Yeah. I mean, I think visually it fits, just really, really fits so well with the imagery, the color, the quality of the image, in a way that your other work on 16 and, fitted that kind of hazy, nostalgic kind of, and the imagery, they go together very, very well. The quality of the image and the material you're using, I think. Unfortunately, we're at the end of our time, so I'm not going to be able to ask you any more questions, but thank you very, very much for joining us, and look forward to your next, which will that be in another 7 years, do you think?
That'll be a lot sooner.
Okay, thank you very much, Lewis.
Thank you.